Greetings indie warriors, Old Gamer Joe back with you today for another review as we look at The Legend of Tianding, a 2D side-scrolling action game based at least somewhat off of actual historical events that took place in the early 20th century. This is a time where Taiwan finds itself under the rule of Japan, and Liao Tianding, a Robin Hood figure of sorts, is being hunted by the authorities for standing up for the little guy essentially, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, the whole deal. The Legend of Tianding has plenty to say throughout its various chapters, and it doesn't shy away from exploring some heavy topics such as oppression or racism, and while the story does tend to drag its feet at times and is riddled with some grammatical errors, it's a message that hits home and reminds us of how we can learn from the past. The gameplay is split between exploring the city of Taipei and battling your way through wherever the story takes you next, utilizing the game's excellent combat system. Controls are very crisp and responsive here, as Liao can of course jump, double jump, crouch, and dodge behind enemies and through obstacles with the tap of a button. This dodge can also be performed while you're airborne, and you're also equipped with a spider wire that allows you to grapple onto objects in order to reach otherwise unreachable areas. This mechanic might take a little bit of getting used to, but it has been tweaked quite a bit since I last previewed this game, so it works far more effectively than it did a few months ago when I was testing things out. You have your standard attacks, of course, with your default weapon, which can be upgraded by spending gold in the city, but perhaps the most interesting gameplay element is the ability to disarm enemies using your scarf, steal their weapons, and then use those weapons against them. This could be anything from an axe to a sword to even guns and a rocket launcher, and if you don't like carrying that weapon around, you have the ability to toss it aside. You also have buns that you can consume in order to regain health. Consuming one of these does trigger a short animation, so there were a few moments where it could be a bit frustrating to try and heal during battles, but thankfully the game features two difficulty options. You have the Gentleman Thief, which is a mostly stress-free experience, or Wanted Outlaw, which is far more challenging. I never had any issues in the game with losing progress thanks to a pretty generous checkpoint system where you'll just sip a tea to save your progress, so you don't have to worry about that so much. And another thing worth mentioning is that you can equip various talismans at these checkpoints, and these will give you some advantages in battle. For example, more health being restored if you consume a bun, or even a triple jump that will make the platforming sections a bit easier to handle. You can deflect certain bullets back towards enemies if your timing is good as well, and I also really liked how Liao evolved as a character throughout, acquiring more abilities like wall jumping along the way. There is no traditional leveling system here, but you will get stronger through finding items, progressing through the story, and taking on some of the game's side quests. Legend of Tianding's combat feels fantastic throughout, helped by a consistently fluid frame rate on the PC version. On my 2070 Super, the game never dipped below 100 frames per second, which is great news for a combat engine that is at least somewhat timing-based, though more casual players will likely be able to mash their way to victory outside of some tricky boss encounters, particularly that last one that had me raging a bit. Where I found this game to be less thrilling was in its city exploration sections, which dominate about half of the game. After you've completed a chapter, you're typically dumped back into Taipei, where you are more or less relegated to running a bunch of fetch quests in order to advance the story forward. It isn't helped that while the story really is fascinating at times, it's very slow in getting to the point at other times. Getting around the city is easy enough with a fast travel system, but for as lively as it looks and feels, I really found these moments in the game to zap a lot of my energy, leaving me hungry to get back to the combat sections. One nice feature though is that you do have the ability to revisit areas that were previously completed if you've missed treasures, and again, there are a decent amount of side quests to undertake here, but many of them are rather dull, just as some of the dialogue can be. There were multiple times where I was screaming internally just to get to the point already. I should also mention that there is a card game to be learned within the city, but I only played it once as the rules were way over my head. I'm not a card fan to start with, but I somehow won. Even though the city exploration wasn't my particular cup of tea, I think one thing we'll all be able to agree on is that the Legend of Tianding is stunning to look at. The city oozes history and feels lived in, with bustling street vendors, seedy alleyways, gorgeous set pieces that look as though they were directly pulled from that early 20th century era. You can feel the rich history in every corner of Taipei, which makes it all the more disappointing that the city itself is more fun to look at and take in than it is to interact with gameplay-wise. The manga art that I touched on earlier is just breathtaking, and the game's animations are truly magical. It's a beautiful game with incredible attention to small details that all feed into The Legend of Tianding being one of the most visually striking indie games of the year. Equipped with an equally authentic soundtrack and voice acting, I was also impressed with the sound design here. Characters will occasionally let out little quips in battle that aren't irritating like they can be in other games. The musical compositions are breathtaking at times, and even smaller smaller details like the sound of footsteps or pencils scratching against paper during the cutscenes are just fantastic. This game is absolutely gorgeous to take in, both visually and in terms of its audio design. The Legend of Tianding does have some pacing issues, but it also has a really big heart. As someone who loved classic tales of Robin Hood, I did fall in love with Liao's journey even when the game did its best to make the storytelling unenjoyable. The city exploration isn't all that fun in my personal opinion, but the combat sure is. It really does steal the show. I loved learning new combos, stringing them together with drop kicks, and getting through tricky platforming sections to discover new treasures. The game has a lot to say, and some of which is very important, but there were other times where I just wish it would have said it sooner. In the end though, it's a game that does ultimately reward the player, and I was really glad to have played this one. Thank you so much for watching the latest video from I Dream of Indie. We would now like to take a moment to pay tribute to our great indie warriors who support us through channel memberships. Mitchell Hall, Bunny, Kevilo, Bill T, Christian Cruz, Chris Jackson, Nathan Moore, Peach, Adriana Amato, CJR, PSC, C Coil, Skeptism, Jen Rose, Jesse, CPM, Julian Colbus, JRS the 8th, Raylin, and Marky Mint. Thank you so much for all you do for independent developers, publishers, and for I Dream of Indie. Everybody else, please head down to the description box below. Let's defeat the gaming echo chamber and bring a voice to the voiceless ones in gaming.